Hello, this is iPo Swords, and today we're going to be looking at an artificially and fraudulently aged reproduction of an early medieval sword. As always with these artificially aged reproductions, this is a demonetized video provided entirely as an educational source. This particular antique has been aged via accelerated aging with an acid. I'm not going to talk all that much about the stylistic and proportional problems with this particular design, as I have not identified who manufactured it, so we're going to focus mostly on the artificial aging that has been done. Let's start by looking at the actual method they've used in order to create an artificially aged appearance. As you can see in the tip of the blade here, several portions of the blade remain completely unetched. This is probably because of the way they applied the acid. I'm assuming they wiped it onto the blade with something like a sponge and then let it eat away for an extended period of time. This led to the unetched portions as well as the heavily etched portions being so different in height. It's also one of the telltale signs that this is not an actual antique. Actual antiques, of course, will have a fairly even smattering of rust, which would then be cleaned off, leaving the dark patination. This is a very shallow corrosion, and it is clearly affecting only portions of the blade that were submerged or covered in the acid solution. You'll also note that the way the fuller terminates is not quite even, being closer on one side than the other. While this is something you do see in some antiques, it's a bit of a sign that this was a cheap reproduction prior to the artificial aging. Moving on to the hilt, let's look at one of the design features that I do want to mention, and that's the fact that the tang is of equal width during the entire length. Actual antiques of this era would have flared closer towards the blade and then tapered down towards the pommel in order to provide a more stable tang and a stronger construction. Once again, on the front of the blade, on the downwards edge, you can see a portion that has been completely unetched. It's also worth looking at the amount of etching that has occurred at the transition between the blade and the crossguard, and you'll note that it has not been as intensely cleaned as the rest of the blade, having none of the bright white spots. This is indicative of the fact that the blade has been polished after etching in order to make it seem less monotonous than it would if it were not cleaned. If this blade were not cleaned, the entire thing would have a fairly dark appearance, as you can see on the transition near the guard. Here we can see a close-up which shows us exactly how this was done. Certain areas were left unetched while other areas were etched quite heavily. You can also see near the fuller where it has been polished on the top edge. This is of course something you don't do with an actual antique. Polishing off the patina destroys the value. However, of course, someone interested in selling a fraudulent sword doesn't really care about that, do they? Moving on to the hilt components, you can see that it has been bashed around a bit before being etched once again in acid. You'll also note that there's the same speckled appearance on the tang, which is not something you'd see on an antique sword, as this would have been covered in an organic material for most of its time, either underground or in a lake. As a result, this is not the way you'd expect to see an antique's tang. I will note that this does appear to have actually been peened, and this is something that not all reproductions do. So props to the faker for actually using a somewhat representative type of pommel construction. I'm not going to talk too much about the proportions, but the crossguard is obviously far too narrow for this style of blade, although it's impossible to pin down exactly what type of sword they were trying to make here, partially because of the inaccuracies and partially because a wheel pommel with a straight crossguard was the style of sword used for many hundreds of years. Anyway, just a very quick video looking at a pretty poor fake. That's all for now. Until next time, stay sharp.